People who grew up in the 1970s often don't describe themselves as lonely. They say they're fine. They had classmates, neighbours, people they spoke to every day. What they didn't have or didn't expect was emotional closeness. Not because they rejected connection, but because no one taught them it was necessary. Friendship existed, but intimacy was restrained. Feelings were private, needs were quiet, distance wasn't painful, it was normal. And when distance feels normal long enough, you stop noticing it as absence. People who grew up in the 70s were shaped by an environment where emotional restraint was quietly praised. Childhood was not centered around self-expression or emotional validation. Instead, it emphasized adaptation, endurance, and learning how to manage oneself early. Adults were often overwhelmed by economic uncertainty, social change, and rigid cultural roles. As a result, emotional attention was limited, not intentionally withheld, but stretched thin. Children absorbed this atmosphere quickly. They learned that asking for too much emotional support could feel inconvenient or inappropriate. Comfort was practical, not verbal. Affection existed, but it was often shown through provision, responsibility, or sense rather than words. Over time, children internalized an important rule. Emotions were something to be handled privately. This didn't make them emotionally numb. It made them emotionally self-contained. Feelings were acknowledged internally but rarely shared outwardly. Vulnerability wasn't forbidden, but it wasn't encouraged either. There were few examples of adults openly discussing fear, sadness, or uncertainty. As these children grew, emotional independence became part of their identity. They learned to regulate themselves without relying heavily on others. This skill allowed them to function well in many areas of life. But it also quietly taught them that closeness was optional, not essential, something extra rather than something foundational. Friendships in the 1970s were often built on shared space rather than shared inner worlds. Children played together, studied together, walked the same routes home, and spent long hours in each other's presence. Yet emotional disclosure was rare. Conversations focused on activities, routines, or surface-level experiences rather than internal struggles. There was limited language for emotions like anxiety, confusion, or self-doubt. Children often lack the vocabulary and the permission to talk about what they felt inside. As a result, friendship became something you did, not something you revealed yourself within. Being close physically did not necessarily mean being emotionally known. This shaped how connection was understood. Trust was associated with reliability and familiarity, not vulnerability. A good friend was someone who showed up consistently, not someone who explored your inner life. Emotional sharing felt unnecessary, sometimes even uncomfortable, because it had never been modeled as part of friendship. Over time, this created a subtle disconnect. People could feel socially connected while remaining emotionally distant. Relationships felt stable, but not deeply intimate. This wasn't experienced as loss, it was simply the norm. Emotional closeness wasn't absent. It just wasn't part of the definition of friendship they learned growing up. In the 1970s, independence was not only encouraged, it was equated with maturity. Children who managed their problems quietly were praised as strong and capable. Those who needed reassurance or emotional guidance were often described as sensitive, dramatic, or not yet grown. Over time, this distinction shaped how children evaluated themselves. Relying on others began to feel like a weakness rather than a natural part of being human. Solving problems alone became a source of pride. Emotional self-sufficiency was rewarded socially, while dependence carried subtle shame. Gradually, independence stopped being a practical skill and became a personal identity. As this identity formed, intimacy began to feel unnecessary. Emotional closeness required slowing down, explaining oneself, and admitting uncertainty, behaviors that conflicted with the value placed on self-management. Letting someone in felt inefficient and sometimes intrusive. This did not mean people avoided relationships. They formed them with clear boundaries. They valued autonomy within connection, but depth was often limited by design. Intimacy felt optional, not essential, because survival had never required it. When independence becomes the core of identity, closeness can feel like an interruption rather than a resource. Many people from this generation learned early to observe more than they shared. Listening felt safer than speaking. Processing emotions internally felt more controlled than expressing them openly. Feelings were acknowledged quietly, contained within the self, and rarely offered to others without careful consideration. This habit created psychological self-reliance. They became skilled at monitoring their own reactions, regulating distress, and continuing forward without external reassurance. On the surface, this appeared as emotional stability. Underneath, it often meant carrying emotional weight alone. Expressing vulnerability was not instinctive. It required conscious effort and sometimes felt unnatural. Sharing personal emotions risked misunderstanding, judgment, or dismissal. Experiences many had learned to avoid early on. Silence felt safer than explanation. This pattern did not result in emotional disconnection. These individuals often felt deeply, but they felt privately. Their emotional world was internal, organized, and largely unseen. They were not emotionally distant by nature. They were emotionally contained by habit. A habit formed in an environment where expression was not practiced and privacy was protection. For many people who grew up in the 1970s, emotional needs were minimized early in life. They learned to function without frequent reassurance, emotional processing, or overt support. Because of this, having a small number of close relationships felt natural rather than lacking. One or two trusted connections often seemed sufficient. Depth was not absent, it was rationed. Emotional energy was something to be used carefully, not distributed widely. Maintaining many close bonds felt unnecessary and, at times, overwhelming. Fewer relationships meant fewer expectations, fewer emotional demands, and fewer situations requiring vulnerability. Stability mattered more than variety. A small circle offered predictability and safety. Adding more people increased complexity and risk of misunderstanding, disappointment, or emotional exposure. For individuals trained to manage themselves, this felt inefficient. This preference was not rooted in antisocial tendencies, it was rooted in conservation. Emotional closeness required effort and carried responsibility. Having few close friends allowed them to remain connected without feeling emotionally overextended. What others might interpret as isolation often felt like balance. They were not avoiding intimacy, they were regulating it. And within that regulation, enough was defined not by quantity, but by emotional sustainability. Trust for this generation rarely formed through quick emotional disclosure. Instead, it developed slowly through consistency, reliability, and time. Trust was demonstrated through actions rather than words, by showing up, keeping promises, and remaining present without demanding emotional explanation. Sharing personal struggles felt risky. Once something was said, it could not be taken back. Vulnerability carried permanence, and that permanence felt dangerous. As a result, disclosure was measured and often delayed. People waited until they were certain the relationship could hold what was shared. This behavior was often mistaken for emotional distance or guardedness. In reality, it reflected learned caution. Many had early experiences where openness was met with dismissal, discomfort, or silence. Those experiences taught them that trust was fragile, so they protected it carefully. They did not withhold emotions to punish others, they withheld to preserve stability. Trust, when it arrived, was deep, but it arrived slowly, quietly, and without announcement. Many people who grew up in the 1970s are socially capable and outwardly at ease. They know how to converse, collaborate, and navigate group settings without difficulty. Social interaction feels familiar and manageable. It follows clear rules and expectations, which makes it safe. Emotional exposure, however, is a different experience. While conversation can flow easily, revealing inner feelings feels far more complex. Social connection does not automatically translate into emotional closeness. They may be friendly, helpful, and well-liked, yet still keep their internal world private. This often creates a visible gap. Others may assume that social comfort means emotional openness, and become confused when intimacy does not deepen. The individual may appear reserved or distant even though they are fully engaged socially. This pattern is frequently misunderstood as emotional coldness or lack of interest. In reality, it reflects emotional conservation. Feelings are treated as valuable and personal, not casually shared. Being known emotionally requires trust and time, not just interaction. As a result, many from this background are surrounded by people, yet deeply known by very few. This is not because they reject closeness, but because they differentiate clearly between social presence and emotional exposure. Loneliness for this group rarely announces itself loudly. It does not arrive with dramatic sadness or overt longing. Instead, it hums quietly in the background, often unnoticed for long periods of time. Because they learned early to manage themselves, the absence of emotional support feels familiar. They do not necessarily crave connection in everyday life. Routine, responsibility, and self-sufficiency fill much of the emotional space. Loneliness becomes noticeable only in specific moments, during illness, loss, major life transitions, or emotional strain. In those moments, the lack of deep support is felt, not as abandonment, but as quiet absence. They are not surprised by it. They are accustomed to handling things alone. This familiarity can make loneliness difficult to recognize, even harder to name. It feels less like pain and more like background silence. As a result, their loneliness often goes unseen, by others and by themselves. It exists without urgency, without complaint, and without clear language. It is not dramatic, but it is persistent, shaped by years of emotional self-reliance. When people grow up managing themselves emotionally, reaching out does not come naturally. Asking for help feels unnecessary and sometimes undeserved. Over time, this turns into a quiet rule. If you can handle it alone, you should. This mindset does not lead to visible breakdown. Life continues to function. Responsibilities are met. Relationships remain intact. From the outside, there appears to be no crisis, but internally, something accumulates. Emotional effort is constantly spent on self-regulation. Stress, grief, and uncertainty are absorbed rather than shared. There is little release, little relief. Feelings are processed privately, which requires energy and attention. Over years, this creates emotional fatigue, not exhaustion, but weariness. Because needs were minimized early, they often struggle to recognize when support would help. Even in moments of strain, asking feels inappropriate. Support becomes optional rather than restorative. The cost is subtle, life works, but something remains untouched. Joy feels quieter, relief feels delayed. Emotional depth exists, but it is rarely mirrored. This is the price of always being okay, not collapse, but quiet depletion. Having few close friends is not a flaw. For many who grew up in the 1970s, it is the natural outcome of an environment where emotional closeness was never central. They were shaped by conditions that valued endurance, privacy, and self-sufficiency. These individuals are not broken, they are adapted. Distance feels familiar because it once served a purpose, protected stability and reduced emotional risk. But familiarity is not the same as preference. Patterns formed in survival do not have to define connection forever. Understanding where these patterns came from restores choice. It allows individuals to recognize that emotional closeness can be learned, not forced, and entered gradually. Change does not require becoming someone else. It requires permission to need, to share, and to experiment with closeness at a pace that feels safe. Awareness alone creates space, and sometimes that space, the awareness that distance was learned, not chosen, becomes the first form of genuine closeness.